Welcome to today's lecture on hardware. Today we are actually talking about consoles and computers. We want to compare and contrast the two. This lecture is designed for the game simulation and animation course, specifically the foundations course. So the essential question is, how do the primary components of computers and gaming consoles compare and contrast? This is a very interesting segment because what we're looking at specifically is looking at the hardware of a computer that was around before consoles, and then looking at the hardware of your game consoles, especially modern game consoles. So first and foremost, we must define dedicated game consoles. Dedicated game consoles are what we would consider the sole purpose of that item, the sole purpose of that hardware, is to do nothing but play games and connect you to game content. So what we're going to analyze as far as this particular lecture is we're going to look at Generation 7 consoles. Specifically, we're going to look at Nintendo Wii, the Sony PlayStation 3, and the Microsoft Xbox 360. So looking first at the Wii, we can see a few quick specs. The Wii was released in December of 2006. It was originally selling for about $249, and the current sale price is around $149. This is an estimate price. It may be lower in some areas, it may be higher. It really just depends. The CPU that's available on the Wii is actually very slow. The Nintendo Wii actually was based off old technology. And when you're looking at the Nintendo Wii, you would kind of ask the question, well, Nintendo, why did you design an older console? Basically, you're creating a console that's not up to par with everything else on the market. And Nintendo's answer on this was not so much that they wanted to design a console that could compete in terms of hardware. What they wanted to do is introduce the Nintendo Wiimote. The Wiimote is a very new piece of technology in terms of 2006, because before this, wireless technology was not very common for gaming consoles. It was around, however, it wasn't very strong, it wasn't very good. But by 2006, Nintendo had perfected the science. What they had created is the Wiimote. Looking at other specs on Nintendo, if you look at the disc reader, you'll notice that the disc reader is the Nintendo ODD. Nintendo decided to use the ODD format because they didn't want A, piracy, and B, they were just using a simple format that they own the patent to. What this means is they didn't have to get licensing from another company to have rights to use a different format. Nintendo owns the ODD, and what Nintendo wanted to do was prevent piracy. Well, that's an excellent idea because you can't buy an ODD drive anywhere else. The only place is Nintendo. If you also notice, the number of units sold as of 2012, about May 2012, is about 96.56 million units. This is a lot of sales. And what Nintendo was really hoping for was to oversell the competitors. And the competitors, we're going to get to them in a moment, but the competitors were your Sony PS3 and your Microsoft Xbox 360. So if we look at the inside of the Nintendo Wii, we can see that there's several different components. First and foremost, you have your case pieces on the right side, and the case pieces are just there for protection and also the design. Then you look at the middle part of the right side, you can see where you have your ODD drive. This is where your disc actually is inserted for gameplay. On the left side at the top, you see some metal pieces. Those metal pieces are actually used for A, cooling, and B, protection. They help reinforce the case to prevent the motherboard or the ODD drive from getting damaged. You don't want to damage those internal components because A, they're not easily repaired, and B, they are very, very sensitive. At the very bottom on the left side, you notice that you have your motherboard. and you also have a small fan slightly to the left. The motherboard on the Nintendo Wii was exceptionally small, but this is kind of tradition for Nintendo. Most of their consoles have been smaller in the past. Next, we'll move on to the Sony PlayStation 3. The PlayStation 3 released in November of 2006. Its original sale price in the United States was $599. However, it was selling in Europe as well as Japan for more. Its current sale price, again, this is estimated. It's based off region, but estimated is about $299. There are different SKUs, so it is very important to note with the Sony PlayStation 3 as well as the Microsoft Xbox 360 that there are different model versions of those consoles. So what I'm looking at specifically is one of the standard consoles at the release date. The CPU for the PlayStation 3 was a unique cell processor. We call it the PowerPC. And the PowerPC processor was actually very handy for handling graphics as well as other processing functions. You notice there's internal storage of about 60 gigabytes, and that the memory on the console is about 768 megabytes. One thing to note about the Sony PlayStation 3 is it introduced to gaming the Blu-ray DVD player. This piece of hardware allowed game developers to use a ton of storage. They could now, instead of programming smaller games, include tons of game content, and one Blu-ray DVD measures about 50 gigabytes. So what this meant is if you had a multi-disc game, such as Final Fantasy or Mass Effect, those multi-disc games on other consoles could fit on one Blu-ray and work on the PlayStation 3 from a single disc. Notice the number of units sold. Again, this is as of May 2012. You're looking at about 64 million units being sold. This is actually quite interesting because if you compare it to the Nintendo Wii sold almost 30 million units more than the Sony PlayStation 3. However, note the price difference between the two. The Sony PlayStation 3 obviously costs much more. So if we look at the internal components of the Sony PlayStation 3, the case is off the screen at the very top. However, the internal components is what we're really concerned about. So the first thing you notice is that the motherboard is obviously larger. The motherboard being larger allows Sony to use multiple areas on the motherboard to kind of disperse the units for memory, disperse the units for processing, graphics, etc. You also have internal storage on the Sony PlayStation 3. The hard drive is connected at the top right of the motherboard. On the left side of the motherboard, you see that you have a cooling unit, very similar to what you would find in a laptop. The cooling unit has the fan that is at the very top, as well as the heatsink, which is at the bottom left. Above the heatsink, you see that you have the Blu-ray DVD player, and the black piece above the motherboard is simply the back connection for the Sony PS3. Next, we're looking at the Microsoft Xbox 360. First and foremost, the Microsoft Xbox 360 came to the market before any other Generation 7 console. This console was out in November of 2005. It had a release price of $399. This was for the premium model. Its current sale price is about $199. It really depends, again, where you are and also what model you're buying. The CPU that was used on the Microsoft Xbox 360 was a triple-core Xenon 3.2 GHz processor. This was exceptionally fast, and it was also the first time a multi-core processor was used on a gaming console. It had storage, but the storage was external. Generally, if you bought the premium console, you got a 20 gigabyte storage. However, there were other values such as 60, 120, 250, but those were other SKU models. The memory, if you notice, is lower than this PS3. It is at 512 megabytes. However, notice the disk reader is also different. Microsoft, being their second console on the market, decided to use the DVD player. They actually used a DVD dual-layer disc reader. And what they were trying to do is compete with the Sony PlayStation 3, but make a more affordable console. They already had a slight following from the original Microsoft Xbox. However, they knew they did not have the same following that Sony had, because Sony was on its third console. So what Microsoft was trying to do by releasing the 360 was not compete with the Sony PlayStation 3 in terms of hardware. What they were trying to do is actually compete in terms of being to the market first and having an affordable console for players. What this meant is a lot of game developers actually created games for the Microsoft Xbox 360 first, and then ported their game to the Sony PlayStation 3. What this meant for the actual game is the game did not change, therefore the graphics also did not change, but very slightly from one console to the other. Also notice the number of units sold by the Microsoft Xbox 360. This number represents the May 2012 values of 67.2 million consoles sold. What this means is they actually beat out the Sony PlayStation 3 in terms of sales. However, Nintendo again sold nearly 30 million more units. But again, note the price difference between the two consoles. If we look at the internal components of a Microsoft Xbox 360, we see that we have the motherboard, which is very large. It's actually about the same size as a PlayStation 3 motherboard. It's slightly larger. And you see that it's laid out in a very computer-like fashion. Microsoft is primarily a computer-based company. Therefore, it's no surprise that their console would also have the same design as most of their equipment. When you look at the left bottom side, you see that when you first open the console, you have a sensor at the very front of the actual console. It's a little white round dial. We would normally see this as the ring of lights. The ring of lights was actually a sensor to determine your wireless controller strength. And what it did is it connected your controllers, and it also determined whether or not you were in range. Behind the sensor, you see that you have a couple of heat sinks. On the motherboard picture, those heat sinks attach to the graphics and central processing units. There is also a fan that helps to channel the airflow in the system. There's two fans actually. And you have a plastic piece that connects the fans to the heat sinks. That way you can keep airflow and also keep as much dust and dirt out of your system. You also have, looking back at the left bottom picture, the DVD drive. This is where all games were placed into the console for gameplay. And it's a standard DVD drive, very similar to a computer model. At the top left, you see that we have our external hard drive. The external hard drive is a laptop hard drive that was specially formatted for use on the Xbox 360. It also had a very special connector so that you could take it from console to console, as this was external. Moving ahead, we've analyzed the Generation 7 consoles, but what about PC gaming? There are computers out there that are capable of handling all types of different games, and there's really so many different specs, but we're going to hit a couple of the big ones. The CPUs, in particular, the minimal for gaming would be a dual core. By today's standards, generally you would go with a triple or a quad core, and the core speed really varies according to what kind of processor you buy. The general rule of thumb is the more money you spend on your processor, the better the processor it is. That's a general rule of thumb. It does not apply in every case. The storage for a gaming PC would typically be 1 terabyte and up. 1 terabyte is average size for a gaming PC. However, you could go lower depending on what the budget is. Memory for a PC gaming computer is anywhere from 8 gigabytes up to 64 gigabytes. This really depends, again, on your budget and what you're buying. Your graphics cards would normally be brand name of ATI or NVIDIA. There are a couple other companies. However, most are derivatives from ATI or NVIDIA. Looking at your disk reader, you do have options for DVD, Blu-ray, and it really depends on what you're trying to get out of your system. So you could go with a standard DVD, which is 4.7 gigabytes, a dual layer DVD, which is 8.5, or Blu-ray, which again is 50 gigabytes. Wi-Fi is not standard on a PC gaming computer, except for laptops. If you wanted to add the standard, it's excellent. However, for most online gameplay, you would require a hard connection. You are going to use the network port instead of Wi-Fi. The portal for the PC gaming would be the browser and or an in-game portal. It just depends again on the game as well as the system. And the price will vary according to what you're really trying to do as far as online gameplay or even just in general buying the computer. There are multiple user interfaces for a computer. You have the keyboard mouse pair, which is pretty traditional. You could also use controllers. You could use joysticks, driving wheels, pedals. There's flight controls. There's many different things. And if you look into the internal components of a computer, you notice the same basic components that were in all of dedicated consoles. You have a cooling area for the CPU at the very top. You have memory chips. Although the dedicated consoles did not show memory chips, they were soldered directly onto the motherboard. By having your memory chips where they are not soldered to the motherboard, this means you can upgrade your system at any time. You also have a graphics card, which is the red ATI card about halfway down the system. You also have a power supply that's internal. Now, some gaming consoles have internal power supplies, others do not. It really depends on the situation. You have a hard drive on the right side, and above the hard drive, you also have your DVD or Blu-ray drives. Looking at the advantages for consoles, the consoles are specifically designed with CPUs and GPUs meant for gaming. They are compact systems and they're usually portable. You also have unique user interface controls, such as the Wiimote or the DualShock controller. You have unique game content, and you also have better game content, typically for a game console. You also have fewer user input issues, as the consoles are very rigorously tested before they are ever released to market. Computers, on the other hand, have the advantages of faster and stronger CPUs and GPUs. They are easily upgraded to the latest technology. This really depends on your budget. You also have improved cooling systems. Your multi-purpose media and productivity systems can also be your gaming PCs. And you also have various options for user interface controls. Looking finally at the technology transfer. The technology transfer is simply saying the game industry has an impact on other industries. And there are many different ones, such as HD television, touch-sensitive screens, tablets, mobile storage devices, interactive edutainment, medical studies such as the laparoscopic surgeries, which were used with the Wiimote, corporate trainings, and military applications such as flying UAVs, flight simulators, and other applications. At this point, rate yourself and see how you did. If you feel you have this information, that's excellent. However, if you have any questions, please contact your instructor or review the information again. If you still have questions, please make sure you do contact your instructor.